20 plant foods that build stronger bones than milk. This is the claim almost every one of us grew up hearing without question. Drink your milk, or your bones will pay for it later. It is one of the most successful pieces of nutrition marketing in history, and it is also, according to a growing body of long-term research, only part of the real story. The countries with the highest dairy consumption on Earth, the United States, Sweden, Finland, do not have the lowest rates of osteoporosis and hip fracture. In several large cohort studies, they have some of the highest. That single fact does not mean milk is harmful, and it does not mean you should throw out everything you were taught as a kid. But it does mean the simple equation of milk equals strong bones was always incomplete, a marketing shorthand standing in for a much more complicated piece of biology. Bone is not built by calcium alone. It needs vitamin K2 to direct that calcium into the skeleton instead of the arteries, magnesium to actually convert vitamin D into a usable form in the first place, and a steady, non-acidic mineral environment to keep the body from leaching calcium back out of bone once it is already there. Plants, as a category, turn out to be extraordinarily good at supplying exactly that combination, often better than the single glass of milk they have been quietly competing against for decades. One long-running study out of Harvard, tracking tens of thousands of nurses over more than a decade, found no reduction in hip fracture risk among women who drank more milk compared to those who drank less, a result that surprised even the researchers running it and has since been echoed in several other large cohorts. That does not prove milk causes harm, and correlation studies like these always come with real limitations. But it does mean the confident, simple version of the milk story taught in most elementary school health classes was never as settled as it sounded. These are 20 plant foods that, gram for gram and mechanism for mechanism, do more for your skeleton than milk ever could on its own. Before the list itself, it helps to understand what actually builds a bone, because the real story is far more interesting than calcium in equals calcium in bone. Bone tissue is not static. It is constantly being broken down and rebuilt in a cycle called remodeling, run by two types of cells working in constant opposition to each other: osteoclasts that dissolve old bone tissue and osteoblasts that lay down new bone to replace it. Calcium is the raw material for that rebuilding, but at least 3 other factors determine whether the calcium you eat actually ends up reinforcing your skeleton or simply passes through you. Vitamin K2 activates a specific protein called osteocalcin, and osteocalcin is the protein that physically binds calcium into the bone matrix, holding it in place. Without enough vitamin K2 circulating, calcium can end up depositing in soft tissue and arteries instead of bone, which is a large part of why researchers have grown so interested in this specific nutrient over the last 2 decades of cardiovascular and skeletal research. Magnesium, separately, is required to convert vitamin D into its biologically active form, and roughly half of the body's entire magnesium supply is stored inside bone tissue itself, functioning as a structural component, sitting right alongside the calcium crystals. And the surrounding mineral environment matters more than most people realize, because a diet that runs consistently acidic, heavy in certain processed foods, and low in fruits and vegetables, forces the body to pull alkaline calcium out of existing bone to buffer that acidity, a slow, quiet leak that a plant-heavy, potassium-rich diet is unusually effective at preventing in the first place. This is sometimes called the acid-ash hypothesis in the research literature, and while scientists still debate exactly how large its real-world effect is, the underlying chemistry behind it is not seriously disputed, and it lines up with population data showing consistently lower fracture rates in cultures eating diets built primarily around vegetables, legumes, and fruit. None of these 4 mechanisms work in isolation either. A diet that supplies plenty of calcium but almost no vitamin K2 will still struggle to mineralize bone properly, and a diet with excellent magnesium but poor calcium intake runs into the opposite ceiling, which is exactly why looking at food as an interconnected system rather than chasing one nutrient number on a label produces such a different picture than the old milk-centric story ever did. Keep those 3 mechanisms in your head as we go, because they explain exactly why several of the foods on this list outperform milk despite having comparable, or in some cases genuinely lower, raw calcium numbers on paper. There is a 4th factor too, often overlooked: Bone density peaks in early adulthood and then slowly declines for the rest of your life, which means the food choices you make now are not just about avoiding a fracture next year. They are about the size of the mineral reserve you are drawing down from decades into the future. A long, slow-moving project that a single glass of milk a day was never going to solve on its own, regardless of how much calcium it contained. Sesame seeds open this list for good reason. Gram for gram, sesame seeds contain roughly 975 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams, which is nearly 10 times what whole milk provides in that same weight of food. 2 tablespoons of tahini, the ground sesame paste used across Middle Eastern and Mediterranean cooking, delivers a genuinely meaningful dose of that calcium in one serving, along with magnesium and copper, a trace mineral involved in forming the collagen scaffold that bone mineral crystals actually attach themselves to as they harden. Stirred into a salad dressing, drizzled over roasted vegetables, or spread on toast, tahini quietly outperforms a full glass of milk before you have even finished your breakfast. The seeds themselves do contain oxalates that modestly reduce how much of that calcium your body can actually use, which is worth knowing, but even accounting for that reduction, sesame remains one of the single most concentrated calcium sources in the entire plant kingdom, dairy included. Chia seeds carry roughly 630 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams, and unlike many plant-based calcium sources, they arrive with their own built-in delivery system. The soluble fiber in chia forms a thick gel when it meets liquid, which slows digestion and appears in early research to improve overall mineral absorption in the gut, while the seed's substantial magnesium content works cooperatively alongside that calcium rather than competing against it for absorption. 2 tablespoons stirred into water, a smoothie, or a bowl of yogurt is enough on its own to make a real, measurable contribution to your daily intake, and letting the seeds sit for even 10 minutes before eating them allows that gel to fully form, which appears to be part of what makes their mineral content easier for the body to access compared to eating the dry seeds alone. Tofu, specifically the calcium set variety made by coagulating soy milk with calcium sulfate rather than a magnesium-based coagulant, can contain well over 350 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams, a number that rivals dairy milk directly on a like-for-like basis. But tofu brings something milk simply cannot offer: isoflavones, plant compounds structurally similar enough to estrogen that multiple clinical trials have linked regular soy isoflavone intake to preserved bone mineral density, an effect that shows up most clearly in postmenopausal women, whose falling natural estrogen levels are what accelerates bone loss most dramatically in the first place. Worth checking the label specifically for calcium sulfate, since not every tofu brand on the shelf sets with calcium at all, and the difference between a calcium set and a non-calcium set tofu can mean the difference between a genuine calcium source and one that contributes almost nothing on that front despite looking identical in the package. Tempeh, the fermented whole soybean cake, with its distinctive firm, nutty texture, shares tofu's isoflavone advantage and adds something else on top of it. The fermentation process partially breaks down phytic acid, a compound naturally present in many plant seeds that can bind to minerals in the digestive tract and reduce how much of them your body actually absorbs. That fermentation step makes tempeh's calcium and magnesium meaningfully more bioavailable than an equivalent serving of an unfermented soy product. And the fermentation process itself also produces small amounts of vitamin K2 as a byproduct, an unexpected bonus that most people reaching for tempeh purely for its protein content never even realize they are getting. Sliced and pan-seared with a little soy sauce, it holds its texture far better than tofu does under heat, which is part of why it has become a staple in plant-based cooking well beyond its original Indonesian roots. Edamame, whole young soybeans still in their pod, deliver both isoflavones and a genuinely high plant protein content in the same bite, and protein matters here more than people assume. Adequate protein intake is consistently associated with better bone density across long-term observational studies, directly contradicting the older theory that dietary protein leaches calcium out of bone, an idea that has not held up well under closer, more recent scrutiny, especially when that protein arrives from a whole food source that also brings potassium and magnesium along with it in the same package. Steamed and lightly salted, Edamame is also one of the easiest foods on this entire list to turn into an actual habit, since it requires no preparation beyond a few minutes in boiling water, and works as well as a snack in front of the television as it does alongside a proper meal. White beans, particularly navy beans, pack roughly 140 milligrams of calcium per cooked cup, alongside a genuinely serious dose of magnesium, and their high potassium content works directly against the acid load problem described earlier, actively helping the body hold on to the calcium it already has, rather than excreting it through the kidneys. Beans as a category are also a rare source of both calcium and fiber in the same bite, and that fiber feeds gut bacteria that produce short-chain fatty acids, compounds increasingly linked in animal and early human research to improved mineral absorption further down the digestive tract. Chickpeas bring a similar overall profile: calcium, magnesium, and enough potassium to help keep the body's internal mineral balance tilted toward the alkaline side rather than the acidic one. A cup of cooked chickpeas is a genuinely underrated bone health food on its own, and it becomes even more effective blended into hummus with a spoonful of tahini stirred directly in, a combination that stacks two independent plant calcium sources into a single dish without you having to think about it. Roasted with a little olive oil and paprika, chickpeas also make a crunchy snack that replaces the kind of processed, mineral-poor snack food most people reach for by default. Almonds carry roughly 264 milligrams of calcium per 100 grams, alongside one of the richest magnesium contents of any tree nut you can buy. A quarter-cup handful is a meaningful, genuinely portable contribution to your daily total, and the fat naturally present in almonds actually helps your body absorb the fat-soluble vitamin K found in other foods eaten during that same meal, making almonds a quiet multiplier for everything else on this list. Almond butter carries the same profile in a more spreadable form, and combining it with a fig or a piece of fruit turns two separate entries on this list into a single, genuinely effective snack. Collard greens deserve special attention here because of a detail that most simple calcium comparisons miss entirely: bioavailability. Some plant foods look impressively rich in calcium on a nutrition label, but bind a large share of that calcium with oxalates, naturally occurring compounds that physically block mineral absorption in the gut. Collard greens are unusual in being both genuinely high in calcium and unusually low in oxalates at the same time, which means your body actually absorbs a far larger percentage of what is sitting in that leaf. In some published studies, a higher absorption rate than the calcium found in dairy milk itself. This is exactly the kind of detail that a simple milligrams per serving comparison chart completely misses, and it is a large part of why nutrition scientists increasingly talk about absorbable calcium rather than total calcium when they actually compare foods against each other. Kale shares that exact same low oxalate advantage. A single cup of cooked kale delivers roughly 100 milligrams of highly absorbable calcium plus a genuinely enormous dose of vitamin K, specifically the K1 form, which the body is able to partially convert towards some of the same bone protective functions that vitamin K2 performs more directly. Cooking kale briefly, rather than eating it entirely raw, actually improves how much of that calcium your body can access, since heat breaks down some of the plant's cell walls and releases minerals that would otherwise stay locked inside. Bok choy, the mild-flavored Chinese cabbage found in most grocery produce sections, is another low-oxalate leafy green whose calcium absorption rate multiple studies have found comparable to, or in some cases better than, dairy calcium on a per-serving basis, and it arrives alongside a healthy dose of vitamin C, which the body needs specifically to synthesize collagen, the flexible protein framework that bone mineral crystals physically attach to and harden around. Its mild flavor and quick cook time, often just a few minutes in a stir-fry, make it one of the easier low-oxalate greens to introduce to someone who finds kale or collard greens too assertive to enjoy regularly. Turnip greens round out the leafy green category with a combined package of calcium, vitamin K, and vitamin C in one inexpensive, frequently overlooked bunch, and they cook down in a matter of minutes when simply sautéed with garlic and a little olive oil, making them one of the fastest additions on this entire list to actually cook. In parts of the American South, turnip greens have been a dietary staple for generations, long before anyone was framing them in terms of bone density, which is a reminder that some of the best nutrition advice was hiding in traditional food culture the whole time. passed down through generations of home cooks who never needed a peer-reviewed study to know a bunch of greens simmered with a little fat, and garlic was good for you. Watercress, ounce for ounce, is one of the most nutrient-dense leafy greens available anywhere, and its calcium content sits alongside a genuinely notable dose of vitamin K, both low in oxalates the same way kale and collard greens are. A single cup, tossed raw into a sandwich or salad, adds real bone-relevant nutrition for almost no effort and almost no calories, and because it is eaten raw rather than cooked, none of its vitamin C, a nutrient that breaks down with heat, is lost along the way. Broccoli is not usually the first food anyone thinks of for calcium, but a cup of cooked broccoli provides a real, meaningful amount, alongside vitamin C and vitamin K in the same serving, and its sulfur-containing plant compounds have separately been studied for an anti-inflammatory effect on the specific cells responsible for bone remodeling, an active and ongoing area of nutrition research worth watching. Steaming rather than boiling broccoli preserves more of its vitamin C content, since that particular vitamin is water-soluble and leaches out into cooking water fairly easily, and roasting it whole with olive oil is an easy way to make it appealing enough to actually eat regularly. Figs, particularly dried figs, are one of the only fruits with a genuinely notable calcium content, somewhere around 160 milligrams per 100 grams, alongside potassium and magnesium, packed into that same small, sweet bite. A handful of dried figs functions almost like a mineral supplement disguised convincingly as a snack, and their natural sweetness makes them one of the easiest foods on this list to hand to a child who would never willingly eat a plate of turnip greens. Oranges bring considerably less calcium than most of the foods already on this list, but they contribute meaningfully through vitamin C instead. And one large long-term cohort study found that higher overall vitamin C intake was independently associated with greater bone mineral density, an effect researchers believe works through collagen synthesis rather than through calcium delivery itself. Eating the whole fruit rather than drinking juice preserves the fiber and slows sugar absorption, without losing any of that vitamin C contribution. Blackstrap molasses, the thick, dark byproduct left behind after sugar has been refined out of sugarcane, is almost absurdly concentrated by comparison to everything else on this list. A single tablespoon can carry over 170 milligrams of calcium, along with a meaningful dose of iron, magnesium, and potassium, all packed into one spoonful, stirred into a bowl of oatmeal or a mug of hot water. It is worth noting that this is the one food on the list that genuinely functions like a concentrated mineral supplement, rather than a whole food eaten in normal portions, so a spoonful is the goal, not a cupful. Seaweed, wakame, and kelp in particular delivers calcium inside a genuinely mineral-dense marine matrix, and it brings iodine along with it, a mineral that most land-based plants simply do not provide in any meaningful amount, rounding out the broader mineral picture that real bone health depends on, well beyond calcium alone. A small serving stirred into miso soup or tossed into a salad is enough, since seaweed's iodine content is potent enough that more is not automatically better. Natto, fermented whole soybeans with a famously strong flavor, sticky texture, and a devoted following in Japanese cuisine, is the single richest known food source of vitamin K2 in its specific MK7 form, the exact version that research has linked most consistently to directing dietary calcium into bone tissue rather than into soft tissue or arterial walls. No dairy product comes remotely close to natto's vitamin K2 content, which is a real part of why several of the largest population studies on hip fracture risk and vitamin K2 intake were conducted in Japan, where natto has been a dietary staple for centuries. A single small serving, traditionally eaten over rice with a little mustard and soy sauce, provides several times the vitamin K2 of nearly anything else on this entire list, which is exactly why researchers keep coming back to it as a natural case study for what adequate K2 intake actually looks like in a real population, rather than a laboratory setting. Quinoa closes out the list with a meaningful calcium and magnesium combination, alongside a genuinely complete protein profile, all wrapped inside a grain most people are already eating regularly, for entirely different reasons, which makes it one of the single easiest additions on this whole list to work into a diet you already have, without changing a single existing habit. Because quinoa is technically a seed, rather than a true cereal grain, It also carries a slightly different mineral profile than rice or wheat, with meaningfully more magnesium per serving, which quietly reinforces exactly the mechanism this entire video has been building toward. Vitamin D deserves one honest mention before we close, since it did not make the list of 20 foods for a simple reason. Very few whole plant foods naturally contain much of it, and the body makes most of its vitamin D from sunlight exposure on skin rather than diet at all. Some mushrooms, when deliberately exposed to ultraviolet light during growing, do develop meaningful vitamin D content, and fortified plant milks added artificially the same way dairy milk often does. So reading the label on a carton of oat or soy milk for that specific fortification is worth doing if you have already replaced dairy in your diet. But this is the one piece of the four-part puzzle where plants do not have a natural built-in advantage over fortified dairy. And it is worth knowing that rather than pretending otherwise for the sake of a tidy narrative. 20 foods, 4 real underlying mechanisms: bioavailable calcium, vitamin K2 to direct that calcium where it actually needs to go, magnesium to activate vitamin D and build the structural bone matrix itself, and a mineral environment that holds on to calcium instead of quietly leaching it back out over years and decades. Milk supplies exactly one piece of that four-part puzzle reasonably well and leaves the other 3 almost entirely unaddressed, which is a real, measurable part of why some of the highest milk-consuming populations on the planet still post some of the highest fracture rates in long-term published research. None of this means milk is harmful, and none of it means you need to eliminate it from your diet starting tomorrow morning. But the idea that it is the single, irreplaceable key to strong bones simply does not hold up against the actual underlying biology of how bone is built, broken down, and rebuilt every single day of your life. You do not need to add all 20 of these foods to your plate at once, and trying to would probably guarantee you give up on all of them within a week. Pick 3 or 4 that already fit naturally into how you already eat. If you already cook with tahini, keep doing that and add a handful of almonds. If soy already shows up in your kitchen, lean into tofu, edamame, and tempeh together, since their isoflavone effects appear to compound with consistent intake over months and years, not single servings. If leafy greens already make regular appearances, swap in collard greens or bok choy specifically for their bioavailability advantage over the greens you might already be reaching for. And if none of this currently fits into how you eat at all, start with the single easiest entry point on the whole list, a spoonful of tahini stirred into whatever you are already making this week, and let the rest follow gradually rather than trying to overhaul your entire diet in a single afternoon based on one video. Add a spoonful of tahini to your dressing. Swap in collard greens for your next side salad. Stir a spoonful of blackstrap molasses into your morning oatmeal. Your skeleton is rebuilding itself constantly, every single day, whether you think about it or not, remodeling and reforming in a cycle that never actually stops for as long as you are alive. And every one of these 20 foods is quietly handing it better raw material to work with, across all 4 of the mechanisms that actually matter, than a glass of milk ever managed to provide on its own.